50 years on from now, Britain will still be the country of long shadows on cricket grounds, warm beer, invincible green suburbs, dog lovers and pool fillers, and as George Orwell said, old maids bicycling to Holy Communion through the morning mist. So said then Conservative Prime Minister John Major in 1993. Sounds good, doesn't it? I'm sure to this very day, John Major himself could never accept that it was the continued success of his own ideology, in the form of Thatcherism and/or neoliberalism, that did so much to destroy the very Britain he admired. And yet, what he describes there does indeed still exist on this cursed island, if only for a privileged, insulated few. And while ghosts of the past haunt us through everyday images like the Routemaster bus, the decaying royal family, and the Great British Bake Off, the Britain the majority of us live in, the one most of us see every day, is instead dominated by hyper-aggressive commercialism, rentier capitalism, and crumbling public infrastructure. Seriously, sometimes it feels like living in the Soviet Union, but more expensive and shit. But despite all of that, I absolutely adore living here. As an outsider, I can put it down to three things. 1, it's never boring, and the UK's proximity to Europe means that your options are essentially endless. 2, everyone likes a good time, and that its pub culture is globally unrivaled and people are generally extremely tolerant of you living your life any way you want to. And thirdly, it's the people, specifically their sense of humour. Everyone here knows that the UK is an absolute toilet in so many ways, and yet we choose to laugh about it. Here, when life is good, it's fun, and when it's bad, it's funny. For insiders, however, these things are superficial. For a hell of a lot of people, Britishness is more about the long reach of history, tradition, and small c conservatism. And I do think there is tremendous positive value in these things, even if they are only hinted at in the periphery of life here, or at least in my life here. But there is a tension in that. For starters, because the images John Major is speaking to are not, coincidentally, English ones. And that's because of the 4 nations of the UK, England completely dominates the rest, mostly because of the numbers. 80% of the UK's 70 million population lives in England. So considering the domination England has culturally, politically and economically, you might have reason to feel a little bit shortchanged if you are Scottish, Welsh or Northern Irish. I mean, there are other obvious historical factors there too, but we just haven't got the time. So that explains tension number 1. Tension number 2 is that England itself is also insanely unequal. If you're from anywhere in England other than the southeast, which is of course where London is, a city 4 times larger than the UK's second biggest city, you are already at, or likely to be at, a major economic disadvantage. Outside of London, the UK is across the board poorer than Mississippi. So what I'm trying to get at here is that geography in the UK is strongly tied to economics, and that economics are naturally tied to class. I've spoken before about how class is everything here. Not race, not religion, not gender or sexuality. But what I haven't talked about, which is indeed relevant to the topic of this video, so bear with me, is how class is typically measured or perhaps coded. And because we can't peer into a stranger's bank account or know what school they went to, the most common way of instantly knowing where you stand in the pecking order in comparison to another person in the UK is through their accent. So I'm sure everyone appreciates that a posh accent, or received pronunciation as it's known, with origins in the south of England, again, not coincidentally where London is, carries the highest social prestige, let's say. And even though Cockney is a genuinely working class accent also with origins in London, the prevailing English cultural dividing line is the north and the south, with northerners looking down on southerners for being either posh or soft or both, and southerners looking down on northerners for being chavvy or poor or uncultured or whatever. And across England, between these extremes, is everyone else. Each region with a distinct accent, a place in the social hierarchy, and perhaps more than one chip on the old shoulder about it. And this is where we finally arrive in the south-west of England, an area colloquially referred to as the West Country. And the West Country accent, alongside its class status, is perhaps only second to the Brummie accent, the Comic Sans of British accents, is being looked down upon. Of course, everyone thinks everyone else's accent is silly, but the West Country, with the region's agricultural history, is synonymous with being unsophisticated, backwards even, like the equivalent of being a yokel or a redneck. And nestled in the northeast corner of the mostly rural county of Wiltshire is a little town of about 180,000 people by the name of Swindon. Located around 2 hours directly west of London and almost exactly between the two more far populous Reading and Bristol, Swindon might be familiar to fans of Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant's The Office as the location of the Slough-based paper firm's competitor branch. Like Slough and hundreds of other British towns in between more interesting locations, Swindon is a byword for nowhere, regional recession, the post-industrial decay immortalised in Ghost Town by the Specials. So why is it, or how is it, that one of New Wave's finest and much-loved bands, the Beatles of the 80s, as they are so often called, came out of a place like this? The answer is, of course, is that out here, in the regions, is far more representative of what England actually is, what it's all about, than an international metropolis like London. London might as well be its own separate country from England at this point. And towns like Swindon have only recently become synonymous with decline. Not that long ago, villages and towns like this made up the real England, each with rich histories, cultures and rivalries. So when you look closely at popular music in this country from the 60s onwards, you'll notice that while London has always been the natural epicenter of the entertainment industry, the people that make it up are more often than not interlopers from far-flung corners of this quaint little island nation of tribes. And not only were XTC born outsiders with their farmers' accents, unfashionable presentation, and compellingly esoteric songs, but their creative force, or at least their primary creative force, could have had the classic archetype of the English eccentric invented specifically to describe him. Andy Partridge is an absolute freak of nature. He is not a master of all trades genius like Prince, nor is he a childlike idiot savant like Brian Wilson. Instead, he is inspired by the world around him, with its deep history, and driven to mirror it creatively via his restless and overactive imagination. He is an incredibly intelligent yet single-minded individual who is famously difficult to work with, yet is also endlessly witty and charming. He is intellectually grounded and well-read, strident in his atheism and unapologetic about his liberal politics on one hand, and yet has more than a passing interest in the occult and is prone to conspiratorial thinking, bitter outbursts and holding irrational, long-held grudges against people who have wronged him professionally and personally. And while I have myself always been perhaps unfairly skeptical of people who claim to experience synesthesia, I believe him when he says that he can hear the world because it is clearly borne out in his songwriting. Which is to say, his music sounds like what it's about. This guy is the real deal. He designs board games in his spare time and similarly approaches songwriting like he would a puzzle, endlessly tinkering, identifying and connecting pathways until the pieces fit naturally into place. A complicated game, as he calls it. And not to take anything away from Colin Moulding, who, while less prolific, is actually responsible for XTC's most famous and commercially successful work, no doubt to Andy's endless chagrin, but it says something about XTC as a unit that they were formed around a mercurial and spectrumy individual like Andy Partridge. And that is to say, unlike 99% of people working in this industry of cool, the key to both XTC's success and paradoxical lack of success is that they are seriously uncool. Instead, they are unfashionably clever. These guys don't know or care what cool is. I've talked about how punk and new wave opened the door for quote-unquote ugly people like Johnny Rotten, Elvis Costello, or say Ian Dury. But XTC are eating from a different side of the same plate. The defiant stance of punk turns ugly into cool, but XTC, who in all fairness are or were perfectly handsome young men in their prime, their stance is basically being awkward and dorky. And not in an ironic hipster, they were so uncool they were cool kind of way, but you would have deliberately bullied these dweebs in school sort of way. This is not putting drugs up your nose and trashing hotel rooms music. This is playing Scrabble and being tucked into bed before 11 PM music. Less Hammer of the Gods, more Warhammer. And far from this being a criticism, it's not only why they have such a dedicated and persistent cult following to this day, it also explains why their music is so thoroughly through-written. It stands the test of time because they are passionate music nerds who ignored, or perhaps were not even aware of, things like fashion and trends and all the other peripheral stuff that could have made them household names, were it not also for Andy's tragic nervous breakdown that so thwarted their rise to the toppermost of the poppermost. And not because they necessarily knew what they were doing or trying to invent anything new and spearhead some kind of movement. Black Sea is a reasonably early point in their career where they basically accidentally predicted the future, perfectly telegraphing the concept and sound of Britpop almost 15 years before the phenomenon came to dominate the business, at least on this side of the pond. An uncool, proto-Cool Britannia record before Cool Britannia was cool. A new wave, high-energy explosion of regional Middle England angst, brought about firstly through the natural hunger of four young dorks from nowhere shooting for the stars, and their personal interest in and fetishization of their own Englishness that would come to be a mainstay of their career from that point forward. I was a relative latecomer to XTC in so many ways. Perhaps like Big Star, they were a name that I heard around the place a lot before I had cause to investigate them. And also like Big Star, they have a considerably obsessive cult fan base when you consider their relative lack of commercial success during their time. But it really was on hearing Black Sea for the first time, specifically the opening track, that I immediately clicked. I played it around to all my friends, saying, "Guess what year you reckon this is from?" So impressed I was that Britpop had secretly been invented by XTC on this album at least a decade earlier than anyone else thought. And this is the real deal. The music hooks you and then the lyrics keep you coming back for more. For me, opening the gateway to XTC's long, varied and fascinating career. I love these dweebs. Formed in the early to mid-70s in Swindon, Wiltshire in southwest England, XTC went through various name and lineup changes in their early years, but were primarily based around the songwriting partnership between Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding. Early stylistic touchstones included the pop of the ubiquitous Beatles and the Monkees, alongside more varied influences including glam rock, psychedelic rock, jazz fusion and avant-garde. Local guitar hero and depressive diabetic Dave Gregory was known and admired by Andy Partridge. However, due to Andy's newfound obsession with New York Dolls, Dave failed his then audition for the Helium Kids, as they were then known, on account of being too good for punk rock. The band enlisted drummer Terry Chambers and settled their original lineup with keyboardist Barry Andrews, signing to Richard Branson's Virgin Records on the recommendation of influential DJ John Peel, and releasing their first album, White Music, in 1978. While I can't say I rate this album particularly highly, it set out XTC's brand of agitated amphetamine rock and a 2/3 songwriting ratio between Andy and Colin Moulding in Andy's favour that set their creative dynamic going forward. The second album, released in the same year, Go 2, offered basically more of the same, but saw the end of keyboardist Barry Andrews' association with the band on account of persistent and irreconcilable tensions between him and Andy. Following this, the band's classic lineup was formed after finally admitting Dave Gregory as the band's second guitarist, and Colin Moulding stepped out from Andy's songwriting shadow with Life Begins at the Hop, one of XTC's enduring early classic singles. He did one even better with Making Plans for Nigel, the lead single from their 1979 album Drums and Wires, a legendary slice of propulsive and angular new wave pop and social satire. And while not technically the highest charting single of their career, is absolutely the song they are most associated with to this day. And Nigel is as good an example of any XTC song of this era, really leaning into the two guitar thing between Andy and Dave.
And if young Nigel says he's happy, he must be happy, he must be happy, he must be happy in his world.
Really quite choppy and angular in its way, and not a hint of the kind of earning kind of stuff that they so derided as guitar players. The solo itself is also quite chunky as well. And and relatively harmonically dissonant as well, as if the parts are pushing somewhat against each other. And that taken with the mechanical clang of the drum part in the song evokes the song's industrial subject matter, something you get time and time again with XTC. The music sounds like what it's about. Another notable example of this on the album is Colin's bass guitar part on Helicopter, which sounds like the thrum of a rotating propeller. So probably on account of Nigel being the first song on this album, on the original UK version of it at least, Drums and Wires is perhaps considered their best known record, and certainly the one where everything really came together for them for the first time, under the guidance of producer Steve Lillywhite. And that sound is energetic, quirky and dissonant, so much so that in certain moments it's hard to tell if the guitars are deliberately out of tune. The intro of When You're Near Me, I Have Difficulty springs immediately to mind. But it nonetheless works because all this weirdo music for dorks is also very catchy and poppy. Not unlike the Talking Heads, a band you could perhaps consider XTC's American analogue. You'll notice the wordless high-pitched backing vocals that feature in almost all of their songs, perhaps an equivalent of today's millennial whoop or indie folk's hey-ho motif. Andy's Reel by Reel, the opening track on side 2, is my personal favourite on Drums and Wires due to the frankly insane amount of hooks in it. So the verse begins like this.
In the secret time, invading our privacy. On the way we mine, we play for the ministry.
It's quite straight ahead with this paranoid lyric about government surveillance, and then a key change into a circular ska influence bit.
They can feel you in bed, or when you take a bath. They can tape every cry, they can tape every laugh. They can turn you around, so you wonder what's real.
Into the first of the song's 2 choruses, that's 2 back-to-back choruses.
Real, by real. Busy little bees recording everything you feel. Unreal, by real.
Same again. And then into the second chorus.
Real by real by real by. Oh, real by real by real by. Oh.
Just an insane amount of hooks. And that's just the basic song. It then goes on to this completely separate bridge that bears almost no relation to the rest of it, an impossibly clever and non-bluesy guitar solo from Dave Gregory, and despite all that, is still over in less than 4 minutes. So for those in the band as well as outside of it, Drums and Wires is felt to be where XTC's career truly began. The commercial success of Colin's songs over Andy's also set them on a course that would eventually drive something of a wedge between them, especially considering Andy's obsessive-compulsive, some would say controlling nature. On the plus side, it did however mean that Andy's competitive instinct led him to steer the band in an even more poppy and direct direction for their next album. It also stands to reason that they would retain producer Steve Lillywhite for Black Sea, as well as record in the same facility, Townhouse Studios in London's Shepherd's Bush. And while I do think Black Sea has the better tunes on it and is all around more sonically cohesive and hard-hitting, I think it's fair to say that Drums and Wires and Black Sea could be reasonably considered like a Volume 1 and Volume 2, not unlike the Beatles' Rubber Soul and Revolver. They capture a distinct early chapter in the band's career, as well as being a product of the endless touring and recording cycle that they were now well locked into. That both made them an incredible band, but at the same time drove this version of XTC, at least, eventually straight into the ground. And I've characterised XTC as uncool or unrock and roll, perhaps quite unfairly, without really explaining that very much. But so much of the lifestyle differences for the groups of this era were more down to the aesthetics of punk and new wave as much as anything else. It's not like these guys were straight edges or anything. In fact, Andy's downward spiral, in contrast to the band's professional upward trajectory over the next couple of years, specifically relate to his addiction to Valium since first being prescribed the drug at age 12 to help manage his anxiety. And it's such a damn shame that the punishing nature of the industry could do this to people, and to my mind, it's a miracle that more groups caught in this particular treadmill and making almost no money out of it for themselves, I might add, didn't also implode one way or the other under this pressure. Younger people are, of course, naturally more resilient to constant travel, lack of sleep, and the general monotony of touring anyway. And while 45 years later we can be all sad about the what-ifs of XTC's career, it's ultimately the circumstances of this music that made it so explosive and powerful in the first place. So another positive way to look at it is that Andy's personal predicament went to precipitate a change of course for the band that indeed produced some, in fact, a lot of more incredible, imaginative music. And it delivered us this, perhaps their most exhilarating, steel-edged, young and hungry statement. Let's go. Coming out of, or just about surviving, the Second World War, for a declining empire, Britain really got its tyres pumped via its domination of global culture in the 60s, thanks in no small part to the unlikely invention of modern rock music, starting with the Beatles and the British invasion, and then going on to popularise the blues rock that dominated at least half of the next decade. And while I've argued previously how weird it is that white English musicians were able to co-opt or appropriate black music in a way that white Americans couldn't, at least at first, so much of that music was American coded in terms of singing in an ambiguous transatlantic accent like the Beatles mostly did, and being carefully pitched at the American pop audiences musically and thematically. British groups of the 60s who bucked that trend and decided to look inwards rather than outwards for inspiration very often paid a price for doing so. The Kinks most notably leaned into their Britishness, or Englishness specifically I should say, with 1968's Village Green Preservation Society. Not only did Ray Davies' obstinate and melancholy patriotism totally alienate the Kinks' then US audience artistically, the band was quite literally banned from touring the country for several years at their creative peak. Another example might be The Who toiled in relative obscurity for years as far as the American market was concerned, only making a dent in the US after they stopped waving their Union Jacks around and ceased producing power pop in favour of balls to the wall, capital R rock. Music about nothing, ostensibly. The other big players in the mod scene, a movement that actually had far more to do with black American soul than it did the burgeoning rock music, was of course the Small Faces, with their Cockney accents and nods to music hall. Only by changing their name and replacing Steve Marriott with a far more accessible singer in Rod Stewart would they ever manage to gain a foothold in the US. But then in the 90s, of course, the 60s were back, and on this island at least, Oasis and Blur became bigger than God, even if American audiences, still for the most part, never quite caught the Britpop disease. So if the British invasion of the 60s and the Britpop of the 90s represented two peaks of what we might call British, or more specifically, English nationalism in music, the 30 intervening years nonetheless saw its fair share of artists attempting, and for the most part failing, to stage another British invasion. From Slade to Roxy Music to The Smiths, The Jam and Ian Dury, all household names in the UK, speaking to a uniquely British aesthetic and paying the price for doing so as far as their international careers were concerned. This is where XTC enter the story, a band whose earnest Englishness almost verges on parody. As chief songwriters Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding would not think twice about writing a song about medieval farm workers, the ubiquity of the class system, or their favourite railway workshop. XTC's interest in the minutiae of English life comes not just from Andy Partridge being an eccentric, but also as a result of the band's status as outsiders within the UK as well as outside of it. They are a rare type of band that is proud to be described as parochial, provincial, or perhaps pastoral at times. And while the Britpop of the 90s predominantly sold, or perhaps resold, the branding and proud, or perhaps unembarrassed, English stance of The Who and the Kinks' 60s incarnations, it is instead the subject matter rather than the look or the sound where XTC share more in common with their 60s counterparts, particularly Ray Davies of the Kinks, alongside the evergreen inward-looking pop music topics of love, lust and self-loathing. The songs of Black Sea showcase the conservative angst of suburban English life, musings on the industrial era relics of a Britain gone by, and the very real fear of all of this world suddenly being taken away, in this case via the threat of nuclear war, all thoroughly Kinksian in its outlook. Black Sea is also peppered with small but significant historical nods to the Crusades, Londinium, and the mythology of Albion, an ancient name for Britain. On 1994's Park Life, Blur adopted the English aesthetic more than anyone else did in Britpop, particularly drawing from Black Sea's opening track Respectable Street, from which you could reasonably claim provides an almost singular basis for all of the most highly regarded satirical era of Blur's career from 1993 to 1995. But what they took even more from Black Sea than its sideways look at English life is the album's sound. There are a few dimensions to the sound of Black Sea, specifically in its relationship to the sound of Britpop, and again, Blur especially. The first one is that coming from the direction of punk and new wave, there is no element of blues at all in this music. It's interesting to think that the British blues boom could be summarised as white Englishmen playing black music, whereas punk as a genre, if you're willing to ignore the proto-punk of the MC5 and the Stooges, is an almost entirely organic, natively English form of rock, born almost entirely alone, out of class consciousness, and borrowing very little from across the pond. But maybe that debate is the subject of another video. However, as someone reared on classic rock guitar playing as I am personally, blues-style guitar is an easy default style for rock players, perhaps even a lazy approach to playing that sounds cleverer than it really is. What is hard is playing electric guitar without any blues influence at all, which in my opinion, Andy Partridge and Dave Gregory perfected on this album, to my mind due in no small part to Andy's synesthesia. With their disdain for rock guitar cliches, both of these guys, especially Dave Gregory, who is freakishly good, could play rings around most rock players, but for aesthetic reasons chose not to. Instead, their playing is smart, economical, and wholly original for its lack of bluesiness. Blues-style playing has been out of fashion for decades now at this point, but nonetheless, Radiohead spring to my mind as a more recent guitar-based group whose innovative sound also comes from their refusal to indulge any bluesy instincts. And of course, Blur's Graham Coxon owes more than a bit to XTC with his neat and tidy style of playing. And on top of that, and a final note on the guitar work on Black Sea, another advantage of them coming out of punk and new wave is they are not afraid to push their amplifiers, providing a spiky, angular tone that really suits the nature of the songs, Colin's upper register McCartney-esque bass playing, and perfectly complements the punchiness of Terry Chambers' drums. Naturally, as they aged, this rawness became less and less part of XTC's sound on subsequent albums. And as a unit, unlike most bands who came before out of the pre-professionalised industry of the 60s, XTC as a working band operating in the 70s and 80s golden era treadmill of small and medium-sized touring venues across Europe and the United States were tight as all hell. Night after night, sweating it out in clubs, XTC were at their live peak in this era, averaging 6 shows a week, only with breaks in their schedule to record a new album. Sure, it almost killed them, but live recordings of XTC between 79 and 82 suggest that these guys were tighter than 2 coats of paint, to misuse a phrase. There's a Triple J broadcast of them playing in Sydney in 1980 on YouTube that springs immediately to mind. They are simply on fire. I've also often thought that seeing XTC and Elvis Costello in the attractions in this period would basically make for the greatest live gig of all time. Surely they must have shared a bill once or twice over the years. Nevertheless, as another of Andy's persistent quirks, the instrumental arrangements on Black Sea were intended to be recreated live almost exactly as heard on record, and this live approach adds so much to Black Sea's powerful and kinetic energy. Yet another factor in Black Sea's sound that makes it ahead of its time is its clarity. While Led Zeppelin, with the help of producer Glyn Johns, ushered in the era of close miking and general high production values in rock music as early as their 1969 debut, for mostly economic reasons, iconic punk records by major leaguers like The Clash, The Damned, and The Buzzcocks, to name just a few, tended to sound like shit. That is often a deliberate part of the aesthetic for sure, but as nerds, XTC were never going to let their records sound thin and lo-fi, not least once they had properly established themselves as a band. And while being well recorded makes Black Sea sound fresh even today, the main thing that everyone talks about, and quite rightly so, is Terry Chambers' incredible drum sound on this album. Now, while there is no first anything ever, it is generally accepted, at least, that Steve Lillywhite and Hugh Padgham perfected their gated reverb technique on Black Sea, having first experimented with it on Susie and the Banshees' album The Scream 2 years earlier. And if you don't know what that is, it's this. Take an ordinary, dry drum sound with no added reverb on it. Then add a lot of reverb to just the drum elements of the kit and not the cymbals. Then use a gate, which is a simple effect or plugin that takes any signal and cuts it off after whatever number of milliseconds you tell it to, and apply that to the reverb sound only. And there you have it. This technique went on to define 80s pop, perhaps the most famous use being Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight, ruining it for the rest of us. But as crucial as the use of gated reverb is to the sound of Black Sea, credit must also go to Terry Chambers himself as a drummer. Again, not to pick too much on other punk-era drummers, but while everyone rates Topper Headon of The Clash and Paul Cook of the Sex Pistols, did they ever play anything as hard-hitting and powerful as this? For those rockers among you who have worked with drummers, some drummers can simply play rock, and others simply can't. And it really just comes down to being able, or better yet willing, to smack 7 bells out of the kit, as if your life depends on it. And while I'm sure Terry Chambers probably couldn't do a Purdy shuffle, he can get a crack out of his snare that just cuts through perfectly in a way that I really appreciate and predates that hard-hitting style of drumming that went on to dominate the 1990s with your Chad Smiths and your Dave Grohls, etc. Production-wise, a highly tuned, punchy snare drum sound has also been out of fashion since the 1990s in favour of a thick, broad-spectrum sound. A band I used to be in, we used to joke that the stick was like sucking the tone out of the drum rather than putting it in. Personally, I like the unfashionable 90s drum sounds, and I've been scolded for that by people more knowledgeable than me. Nonetheless, I'm still low-key holding out for the triumphant comeback of the piccolo snare. So shoot me. I always try to resist it whenever the first track on an album is kind of the best. In a sense, it suggests that the rest of the album is somehow of a lower standard, which is obviously not the case here. But as far as setting out your stall and making a strong statement, I struggle to think of many songs as impactful as Respectable Street on any album by anyone. Respectable Street is a song about Bullwood Road, a Swindon street opposite the flat where Andy Partridge was living with his young family at the time. He has talked about spotting the caravans, or trailers, sitting stationary in people's front gardens as totems of aspirational mobility, as well as his nosy and rather overbearing neighbour who seemingly did nothing else but hang out stuff on her washing line and observe the neighbourhood from the safety of her front room curtains. It begins with a deliberately scratchy-sounding preamble, which is, of course, a piano-led rehashing of the song's bridge, in a Noel Coward style, really leaning into the song's Englishness and certainly providing a sharp contrast to the muscular aggression of the rest of the song, and indeed the rest of the album. Andy has described the slashing angular guitar chords as the sound of a car door slamming. The rhythm section then comes crashing into the song proper, with Terry's pounding drum part emphasising the toms, and a characteristically nimble bass part from Colin. Suitably, Andy's lyric describes the classic English obsession with social status in this fictional neighbourhood, whether through the executive's new car or the family's latest tech gadgets. It also highlights middle-class hypocrisy, arranging clandestine abortions for their promiscuous daughters, and pulling up prim and proper for church on Sunday morning, despite vomiting over their neighbour's fence the night before, after a big night out with the boys. In fact, it was some of that somewhat shocking imagery that prevented the song really taking off as the 4th single released off Black Sea. A real shame, as it is such a powerful song and became a staple of the band's live set for years ahead. A couple of other things worth mentioning is the ping-pong of the dual guitar arrangement, Andy's frenetic noise solo, the Beach Boys' high woo backing vocals, and especially Colin's high vocal part in the last verse.
What you think about that car for? Don't you realize this is Respectable Street?
Singing that while playing the bass line is superhuman in how difficult it is. As someone who for a couple of years at least played Paul McCartney in a tribute act, Singing it all while playing bass beyond the most rudimentary root notes is, in my opinion, the hardest job anyone in a rock band can possibly have. So there you go, a song I will never ever get sick of hearing. Park life before there was a park life. A real punch in the guts, Respectable Street. And the energy does not let up, as we are only given a millisecond of reprieve before Terry's snare drum pickup ushers us into the anti-war disco of generals and majors. While I believe Colin found inspiration in stories of World War I for the track, it's clearly and deliberately lyrically inspecific enough to be taken as a broadly anti-war swipe at the warmongering officer class generally. A sentiment that is surely timeless. In fact, the simplistic lyrics, if anything, are getting in the way of the many, many hooks packed into the song. Firstly, the central guitar riff. The secondary, harmonically related but distinctly different riff. And there's the whistle synth played by Dave Gregory at the end of each verse and again in the song's outro. And the oi, 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 oi in the chorus and other tasteful bits of backing vocals. Moreover, I'm an absolute sucker for any song that basically starts on a 1 chord and then goes down specifically to a minor 5th chord. Combine that with a driving disco beat, and this one just makes me want to dance on the spot forever in a Talking Heads kind of a way. If you thought that was energetic, we go straight into Living Through Another Cuba without missing a single beat. In fact, both Generals and Majors and Cuba are the same tempo, or at least extremely close to, creating a kinetic continuity that really contributes to the idea of Black Sea as a high-energy party record. In fact, as a piece of sequencing, I really admire this decision, as conventional logic would have you separate stylistically similar tracks in the running order. But instead, XTC say, no, you're not allowed to rest, and we're going to keep pummeling you with bangers. And of Colin's Generals and Majors, personally my favourite of the two, if we're splitting hairs, is a bit lyrically basic, Andy Partridge is simply not the sort not to articulate his anti-war anxiety in song, with the Cuba of the title, of course, referring to the Bay of Pigs invasion and the ensuing Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, incorrectly referred to as 1961 in the song. In the song, Andy compares that particular squeaky bum moment, as they say, presumably to the renewed tensions in the late 70s and early 80s, known as the Euro Missile Crisis, and the UK's relative impotence in the face of world events. It's easy to forget now how large the threat of nuclear war hung over Europe at this time, which of course led to the formation of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and the highly influential television show Threads in 1984, both having a huge influence on British culture, least of all on music. What Living Through Another Cuba does not share with its predecessor, however, is really much of a form. It's effectively this riff. On repeat for 4.5 minutes, with the song's title intoned in octave unison every 4 bars, and Andy sounding off in between. It also goes into quite an excellent percussive breakdown with the deft use of multiple delays on Terry's snare drum, with some very dubby experimental results. There's also some programmed electronic percussion that was pretty forward-thinking and unusual in rock for 1980. And the overall effect is quite hypnotic and perhaps druggy in a dance music kind of way, effectively less of a song than a groove, and all the better for it. A live favourite, Living Through Another Cuba orders us to dance while the world burns. Love at First Sight is the second and final of Colin Moulding's songwriting contributions to Black Sea, and while I love Colin's work generally, this is not a track that I'm particularly in love with, to be fair. I will say, however, it is well placed on the album as a change of pace after the first 3 tracks and has some delightfully herky-jerky guitar work, especially Andy's steam engine guitar solo. And if you thought Terry's gated drum sound elsewhere on the record defines the sound of the 80s, the primitive drum pad he is using here, seemingly alongside his snare, is perhaps the most 80s sound ever to my ears. Picking up the energy again after what was only a mild diversion in Love at First Sight, Rocket from a Bottle explodes into action. Like, well, a rocket from a bottle. This is definitely one of my top tracks on Black Sea, and another like Respectable Street that I will absolutely never, ever get tired of hearing. Immediately apparent alongside the chugging, tom-heavy rhythm is the first and possibly only use of acoustic piano on Black Sea, a simple but excellent choice that really helps drive the track forward. I've always marvelled at how minimalistic the verses are for Andy's standards in this song, lyrically and vocally, although the "like today" is pure vintage Andy. The song is simply about the energizing power of love and attraction, using the analogy of setting off a firework to illustrate Andy's burning desire. And in true Andy style, it simply sounds exactly like what it's about.
Like a rocket from a bottle shot free, I've been just explosive since you hit me. I've been up with the larks, I've been shooting up sparks, and I'm feeling in love.
After two goes around with the verse and the chorus, it does a number of genius things that really propel this already explosive song further out into space. Firstly, they put a phaser effect on the entire mix for a bar going into the guitar solo. Then Dave Gregory's almost hair metal-like Rainbow Road guitar solo literally sounds like fireworks exploding in all directions at once. Then finally, the chords beneath him shift and we get one of my favourite key changes of all time.
Like a rocket from a bottle shot free.
It's just so cool how they do that. So where any other songwriter would engineer a key change that goes up to increase the tension and drama, they managed to take it down a semitone into the key of E for the last chorus. See, this is the kind of stuff you get from music nerds. None of this is accidental. They are thinking hard about how to make the best music they can at all times. And this song is just one of many that illustrate this perfectly on Black Sea. It's genius. Closing out side one, Andy's No Language in Our Lungs was born out of his personal frustration at being unable to articulate his feelings in public settings, particularly on stage where he felt least comfortable. But also, the song is a comment on the uptight mentality of English people in general as he perceived them, with their stiff upper lips and suppressed emotions. In sharp contrast to XTC's trademark herky-jerky pop, this track is a bit of a slow motion, but nonetheless heavy and hard-hitting epic, including some fairly serious jazz chords. Not that I can hear it that much, No Language in Our Lungs was musically inspired, apparently, by the slow funk of Free and the arpeggiated guitars of late period Beatles, which you can actually hear quite clearly. In fact, the combined guitar work of Andy and Dave is incredibly impressive if you listen to it actively. The combined dual guitar solo in particular serves the song well, makes great use of space in the mix with their different sounds, and couldn't be further away from the showboating, Ernieing that they so despised. The song also contains an incredible multi-part bridge section that was actually the first part Andy wrote, and he originally envisioned as being its own song.
I thought that I had the whole world in my mouth. I thought I could say what I wanted to say. For a second that thought became a sword in my hand. I could slay any problem that would stand in my way.
Notice the choppy skank in the guitar part in that section, while there's also a very cool, watery synth part played by Dave Gregory in the left channel on the recording.
I felt just like a crusader, lying hard on holy land invader. Nobody can say what they really mean to say. The impotence of your speech came up and hit me that day. I would have made this instrumental, but the way got in the way.
Then this super cool climb up the scale. I love the way he packs the lyrics in that whole section. Very Elvis Costello to me, although I suspect that's not anything deliberate on Andy's part. Perhaps a more conventional sequencing decision was to bunch the mid-tempo, long songs towards the middle of the album. Although, of course, they are broken up by being on different sides of the record. So for the opening of side 2, we have Towers of London, a shall we say, historical song, describing the labourers, or navvies, who built the city of London in the Victorian era, many of them imported labour from Ireland. Bridges of muscles spanning so long and high, merchants from Stepney walking pretty ladies by. Rain is the tears of the never, never navvies who cry for the bridge that doesn't go in the direction of Dublin. Beginning with the clang of an anvil, or at least what sounds like one, plus a snippet of studio chatter, Tales of London brings that vision to life, with Terry's industrial rhythm, the mechanical, almost mindless plod of Colin's bass line, and the repetitive drone of guitars deliberately evoking the psychedelia of the Beatles circa 1966, specifically the song Rain. Altogether, the whole band is working like an interlocking machine in painting this oral picture of workers pounding away. This is only added to by Dave's excellent and tasteful lead guitar work as ever, and the plinky plonk of the synth in the song's excellent recurring bridge. It very cleverly transitions from the key of F before the bridge into G after that, something I would never have noticed myself if someone else hadn't pointed it out to me. While not the album's longest song, Tower of London's near 5.5 minutes make it a key track on Black Sea and a fitting tribute to those who toiled in service of Londinium, and bizarrely offers up a heady and distinctly English psychedelia in its way. Historical songs went on to become more of a significant feature of XTC's records going forward, and Towers of London is a good early example of it done really well. Yet another song that somehow sounds like what it's about is Paper and Iron, brackets, Notes and Coins, which is to say it's simply about money and what you've got to do to get it. An ode to the drudgery of everyday working class British life, perhaps.
Working for paper and for iron, work for the right to keep a tie on. Working for paper and for iron, work for the unicorn and lion.
The unicorn and lion, of course, being the animals depicted on the UK's royal coat of arms, sweating away for the good of the nation. This track and the next are in some ways the kind of possibly throwaway sort of tracks you'd expect to hear buried on the second side of an LP. But because it's XTC, it's really, really good, even if it's perhaps not single material, say. In fact, it's a favourite of mine on Black Sea and one I always look forward to hearing. More than anything, it carries on the album's musical muscularity. They are just a super tight band, and this is one I always look out for on live bootlegs as well from this period. I kind of wish I had more to say about it, but it's really just one of those tunes that speaks for itself. And the new wave of excellence doesn't let up with Burning with Optimism's Flames, opening as it does with a nice bit of somewhat proggy polyrhythm between the guitars and the rhythm section here. And perhaps the album's most clearly heard example of the gated drums technique on Terry's snare in the first few bars. Andy's lyric describing a young woman he likes are densely packed and syncopated within each bar before the band kind of snaps back into a poppy 4/4 for the chorus.
She says she's burning with optimism flames. Away, away. She says she's burning up all her guilt and shames. Away, away.
Each chorus is followed by another typically inventive, abstract and unmusical guitar break, and the bridge of this song, like so many on this record, is pure genius. And then how that transitions into the same polyrhythm of the song's opening underneath a super clean and tasteful finger-picked guitar solo, presumably from Dave Gregory, that verges on jazz. I mean, taken as a whole, I can't imagine more ideas packed into 4 minutes, really. It just goes to show how musically streets ahead these guys were compared to their contemporaries. They could have played anything if they wanted to, and occasionally, on songs like this, they do. In fact, I'd say it's Dave Gregory's moment to shine on Black Sea and an incredible showcase for various inventive styles of guitar playing. There's punk, of course, jazz, a bit of country and western, atonal metal shredding and surf guitar all in there. And in live versions he even throws in bits of Steve Cropper for a laugh. Masterful, these nerds. Eventually reaching number 16 in the UK when released as Black Sea's third single, Sergeant Rock, brackets, is going to help me, is one that Andy would prefer that we forgot. Even if I, and a decent chunk of the then British public, disagree. It's a great, daft little song about an invented comic book character, this Sergeant Rock, a drill sergeant type figure who is supposed to train the song's protagonist, presumably a young Andy, into how to get girls. Perfectly innocent to my ears, even if supposedly the band received a torrent of hate mail for their efforts. Now, I consider myself a feminist for what it's worth, and I'm willing to admit I may have missed something here, but the closest thing to sexism I can see is perhaps the line, "Make the girl mine, keep her stood in line," which I think is at absolute worst just a bit silly. Sergeant Rock is nothing more than a playful bit of whimsy to my ears, but apparently Andy took these criticisms to heart and is at pains to distance himself from it today. Musically, as ever, it fits the themes of the lyrics in a classic English-sounding Soldiers on Parade galumphy beat. A simplistic and enjoyable sing-along chorus and all the typical XTC herky-jerkiness we all know and love. A harmless bit of throwaway pop, but of course, being XTC, it's of course totally inventive, interesting and fun. There's no pleasing some people. Closing out side 2 and Black Sea as a whole, Travels in Nihilon is really quite bizarre in its way. Totally unlike anything I've heard XTC do before or after this. Inspired at least in spirit by a dystopian novel of the same name, the song is Andy's exploration of nihilism. I'm sick of the world, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, tear it all down and start all over again kind of feeling that we've all felt at one time or another. Musically, it's mostly based around a drone, with Terry Chambers' primal tom-heavy rhythm propelling the track forward. Andy's quite abstract vocal soars over the top, and eventually Colin's busy bass line provides the central harmonic motif of the song. Travels in Nihilon is positively, dare I say, psychedelic. XTC's own Tomorrow Never Knows, closing Black Sea with a nightmarish scream into the void. As the band fades out into nothingness, Black Sea then ends with what the band intended to sound like rain, at least initially, but they later decided it sounded like the world's longest piss, which they subsequently decided was a perfect metaphor for their nihilist rejection of the world as depicted in the lyric. A nice bit of dark if somewhat juvenile humour to go out with on Black Sea. So Black Sea was released in September 1980 to critical acclaim, reaching a respectable 16 on the UK albums chart, and was the band's best seller in the USA ever, peaking at number 41. The album sleeve depicts the band in antique diving suits with the letters X, T and C spelt here by a bird, a ship's mast and a half moon. As ever, they toured relentlessly in support of the album all over the world, and while the modest success of both Drums and Wires and Black Sea saw them graduate to an arena-level act, the strain of touring on Andy Partridge was really starting to show. He was suffering from major stress-related memory lapses and long-term withdrawal effects, having broken off his Valium dependency at the insistence of his wife. In a vain attempt to recalibrate XTC as an albums band rather than a live one, and in Andy's mind justify a less intense touring schedule, the next batch of songs that went on to make up 1982's monster double album, English Settlement, drew from an ever-widening stylistic palette, particularly in the use of acoustic instruments and Colin's newfound preference for the rubbery sound of the fretless bass. Not only that, but English Settlement drew further still from XTC's well of Englishness, with its cover even depicting a prehistoric Uffington white horse carved into the chalk hills near Swindon. Its lead single, Senses Working Overtime, became their best-selling single in the UK, and English Settlement itself became their best-selling album in their home country. Many people, quite rightly, consider it their magnum opus. Unfortunately, their upwards trajectory was cut short on the subsequent tour, with Andy Partridge suffering a major panic attack on stage in Paris, halfway through Respectable Street no less. You can see footage of the incident on YouTube, and it's quite heartbreaking to see Andy suffering. While it wasn't literally their last gig, it put a permanent stop to XTC as a touring act. Saddled with crippling debts, the band fell out with their manager, who it turned out was completely swindling them, having borrowed large sums of money from Virgin Records against XTC's future earnings, leaving them culpable even after settling with him out of court. Not being able to tour, they were unable to repay those debts, let alone support themselves, and it is estimated within their 20-year contract with Virgin Records, XTC saw 0 publishing royalties. 0. Naturally, with the least material stake in the band, Terry Chambers went the way of Leggy Mountbatten and tragically moved to Australia, after which XTC never again found a permanent drummer. And yet, incredibly, they carried on making music. 1983's pastoral Mama is unfairly maligned in their catalogue, although it did signal the start of XTC's sudden commercial and critical decline. Coincidentally, wink wink, as soon as they could no longer provide a touring cash cow for the record label. I also have a lot of time for 1984's The Big Express, another critical and commercial flop, but nonetheless proof they still had a lot to give creatively as a band. In fact, I distinctly remember bringing this one home and my wife taking one look at the band on the inner sleeve and saying, "These guys are really uncool." And I'm like, well, yeah, that's what makes them cool. Broadly, I think what I've always liked about a lot of the punk and new wave bands is that the movement was born out of a year zero, forget the past approach. Therefore, the music is for the most part totally original and the furthest thing from derivative that you can get. And XTC exemplify this to a T, with musicianship of the highest level. So I think it makes it especially interesting that during XTC's period in the doldrums during this time, they decided to form a brand new band that exclusively made derivative music, almost like a release valve for these guys who clearly loved music of all kinds. So not only is that why the two albums they released under the pseudonym The Dukes of Stratosphere, 1985's 25 O'Clock and 87's Sonic Sunspot, are so joyous and fun, but also why they are so good. Any fans of Nuggets-era 60s garage rock should check these albums out, as XTC are doing nothing more and nothing less than exactly that style. Interestingly, the first of these two records outsold The Big Express by 2-1, even before XTC's involvement was widely known. Then in 1986, they teamed up with Todd Rundgren for the certified masterpiece Skylarking. I find myself saying this a lot lately, but I agonized over covering either Skylarking or Black Sea for this video. And I'm such a fan of it that I've decided not to talk about it here at all, as I would like to leave the door open to discussing it on its own in a video in the future. If you don't know it, all you do need to know is that it's a masterpiece. The relative success of Skylarking restored some energy to the band as they properly entered their late period, defined by ever more clean and clear production, and a natural move away from punk and towards a more progressive experimentalism. I don't like having to brush over them, but 1989's Oranges and Lemons and 1992's None Such are excellent records, but their seemingly unending tussle with Virgin caused them to go on strike in 1993, and finally they were freed of their debt to the record label in 1997. They managed 2 more albums worth of material before personal issues saw XTC fall apart, although not officially or legally. In the years, the bickering band members have mostly remained active musically, but they have more or less avoided each other. In 2017, Colin Moulding teamed up with Terry Chambers for a project called TC&I, the closest we have yet come to an XTC reunion. Fittingly, as XTC's primary creative force, Andy Partridge has overseen the curation of the band's legacy. As XTC slowly wound down over the decades, he took on producer gigs, wrote for other people, collected and drew comic books, painted toy soldiers, designed board games. He even hosted a kids' television show. Moreover, he has created torrents and torrents of new music. He is endlessly creative and restlessly imaginative. And the funny thing is, Black Sea, the album where I would argue Andy Partridge and XTC casually invented Britpop, is just a tiny snapshot in the wider context of their career, created in the center of a high-pressure, hard-working, hard-touring storm by a bunch of musical obsessives, young and hungry. Without a moment's rest, then they moved on to something completely different, and in the eyes of many, something better. Then they did this again, and again, and again, and again, and again. They gave us so much excellent music in their time. And interestingly, I'm not going to claim that everything they did is absolutely perfect, or in fact that any of it is necessarily, because that's not what XTC are about. They are instead into the craft, into the process, and into the detail. Sometimes it's mind-blowing, other times it's almost mind-blowing. The standard across the board is extremely high in their music, and that's why there really is a legion of people who pore over this stuff and care not one iota for how cool it is then or now. Coolness comes and goes, and what we all thought was cool when we were younger is not cool now. 9 times out of 10, it's been completely forgotten. But not this. Sometimes, it's heartening to think that good stuff just survives sometimes, and is appreciated for what it is. And what Black Sea is a powerful, punchy, poppy and punky slice of new wave that is both primitive and incredibly thoughtful. And what it shows is that sometimes by indulging our niche interests, our obsessions and our neuroses, without simply aping whatever is in the air at the time and in the moment, we all have it within us to come up with something totally new and original. Andy Partridge does this every day of his life. And as much as England laughs at its own decline, or cringe at its own culture, or seek to disown its often problematic history, it will always breed eccentrics, people who can turn something small into something big, something ordinary into the extraordinary. and I, for one, consider myself lucky to be able to immerse myself in that.